الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن سار على سبيله إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So today inshallah we'll be continuing discussing our book Bulugh al-Maram, and we're still discussing Bab Kitab al-Tahara, the book of Tahara, and we're in the Bab, as he mentioned here, Bab Ghusl wa Hukum al-Junub. So discussing matter pertaining to the person in a state of Janaba, and of the act to be done is Ghusl. So this is of those things that the author rahimahullah ta'ala have mentioned regarding these ahkam. So today we'll be continuing and we'll be reading two hadith really pertaining to this discussion. So the first hadith of Aisha, and the hadith that follows that also from her. So both hadith of Aisha radhiyallahu anha.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad. Qala mu'allif rahimahullah. Hadith number 106, narrated A'ishah radiallahu anha. Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I do not permit a menstruating woman or anyone in a state of sexual impurity to enter the mosque. Reported by Abu Dawud. Ibn Khuzayma graded it as authentic. Hadith 107, narrated Aisha radiallahu anha. I and Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to take a ghusl, a bath, due to sexual impurity from the same vessel, and our hands alternated in it. Agreed upon. Ibn Hibban added, and our hands used to meet.
Now, so those are the hadith that are mentioned regarding this discussion regarding al-ghusl wal-ahkam al-junub. So as for the first hadith of Aisha radhiyallahu anha, where it says, and Aisha radhiyallahu anha قالت قال رسول الله عليه السلام إني لا أحل المسجد للحاهض ولا جنب رواه أبو داود وصححه ابن خزيمة. So if we read each hadith separate, as both discuss two separate masail. So we start first with the first hadith of Aisha radhiyallahu anha, and then we'll read the second hadith and discuss the ahkam that can be taken from it. As for the first hadith that was read, the hadith of Aisha radhiyallahu anha, where she mentioned, the Prophet mentioned, inni la uhil al-masjid, that I do not make permissible for one who's in a state of hahid, menstruating woman, or that of a person in a state of janaba, to enter the masjid. So they mentioned regarding concerning that with this hadith, that the first thing we have discussed regarding Aisha al-Mu'mineen before. So we have covered matters, a brief biography of Aisha radhiyallahu anha. So the second thing of this hadith is a matter regarding a takhrij. So in brief regarding takhrij of the hadith, regarding what's the hukum of the hadith, and first knowing what are the sources of this hadith, and also the aqwal of the ulama pertaining to this particular hadith. With this hadith had been mentioned that this hadith, as the author here mentioned, the hadith in the Abu Dawud, and also the hadith, this is the wording taken from Abu Dawud. So this is the wording that is taken from Abu Dawud. So Abu Dawud rahimahullah ta'ala in his Sunan, when he mentioned this hadith that of Aisha, that he mentioned this is a section of the hadith, it's a more longer hadith, but he mentioned just the portion that he needed from the hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ said in this hadith concerning فَإِنِّي لَا أُحِلْ الْمَسْجِدِ لِلْعَاهِدِ وَلَا junub. So that's the hadith in the Abu Dawud. Also of those who have narrated hadith, Ibn Majah. So Ibn Majah rahimahullah ta'ala, also in his Sunan, also have narrated this particular hadith. And others. So others who have narrated this hadith, that they have mentioned also Ibn Khuzaimah, as the author here he mentioned. So the hadith also in the Ibn Khuzaimah, also the hadith in the Al-Bayhaqi, the hadith also in the Al-Bayhaqi, and others who have narrated this hadith. So this hadith have been mentioned by those sources. Then the next thing is to have a discussion regarding what have been said by the ulama pertaining to the ruling, the grading of this hadith. On this matter, you find that the ulama, that is a khilaf between the ulama. Amongst the ulama who take the position that this hadith, it is Sahih, those who hold the hadith to be Hasan, and third, those who take the position the hadith is Da'if. So we could say that they fall into two categories. Those who hold the hadith to be Maqbool, whether they see it as Sahih or Hasan, and those who hold the hadith to be mardud. The hadith it is rejected. The hadith it is da'if. So as for those who take the hadith, I take the position the hadith is somewhat da'if. As he mentioned here, this hadith mukhtalifun fi. As we have stated, that as the author have mentioned that Ibn Khuzaimah, as he state, Sahahu Ibn Khuzaimah. So Ibn Khuzaimah, rahimahullah ta'ala, amongst the ulama who hold the hadith to be authentic. And I mentioned in his Sahih, in his book. Amongst also that those who hold the hadith to be Sahih, they mentioned Abu Zur'a. So Abu Zur'a, all the hadith to be Sahih, as he mentioned, يقولون أن جسرة أن سلمة والحديث والصحيح أن عائشة. That he also concerned the hadith that is also Sahih and Aisha. Also, as we discussed that Surah Hadith is mentioned on Aisha. There's a next narration which is in the Ibn Majah. The hadith is an Salama. So the distinction that the narration that is mentioned here, that of Aisha, that's the hadith mentioned here in the in the Abu Dawud, and the author did not mention Ibn Majah, perhaps because that narration is from Salama. So the hadith in this hadith in the Salama with the same wording in the Ibn Majah. So overall we have Abu Zur'a, all the hadith to be Sahih, also Ibn Khuzaimah, also Ash-Shawkani, also authenticated hadith. So Shawkani, of those who authenticated the hadith in his book, Nail Awtar, and also Sail Al-Jarrar. So Shawkani, one of the ulama of Yemen, who all the hadith to be authentic. And of those who all the hadith to be Hasan, still Maqbul, Ibn Qattan in his book Al-Wahm Al-Iham. So Ibn Qattan, all the hadith to be Sahih, or the hadith to be Hasan. And it is mentioned that Ibn Sayyid al-Nas, so Ibn Sayyid al-Nas, also of those who all the hadith to be Sahih, or all the hadith to be Hasan. They mentioned that Al-Zaylahi, also all the hadith to be Hasan. And also of contemporaries who all the hadith to be Hasan, this hadith of Aisha, that also Sheikh Abdul Shuhaib Arnaud. So Shuhaib Arnaud, in his checking of the book Sunan Abu Dawud, that when he mentioned the hadith, he says hadith isnaduhu Hasan. So Shuhaib Arnaud, all the hadith to be isnaduhu Hasan. Then he kind of somewhat went through that discussion regarding the hadith. So that's concerning and also he mentioned here the hadith in the Al-Bukhari in his book Tariq Al-Kabir. I will mention Al-Bayhaqi. So those are the sorts of the hadith. So overall concerning of those ulama who all the hadith to be within the hadith which is maqbul, whether some see it as Sahih or others take it to be Hasan, but overall they all the hadith to be Sahih. Then also of those of the ulama who take the hadith or pass the judgment that the hadith it is da'if. And amongst those we have Al-Baghawi in his book Sharh Sunnah. And he mentioned also Wadaf Ahmed had the hadith that also he mentioned قال Al-Baghawi that in his book Sharh Sunnah Wadaf Ahmed had the hadith that Imam Al-Baghawi in his book Sharh Sunnah that he narrated that Imam Ahmed all the hadith to be da'if. That Al-Khattabi in his book Ma'alim As-Sunan where he mentioned da'afu had the hadith that ulama all the hadith to be da'if. Then I mentioned the narrator, that one of the narrator that will discuss this narrator mentioned Aflatu. So Aflatu, or the narrator that is discussed, one of them that is he mentioned wa majhul, that Aflatu rawihi majhul la yusah ihtijaj bi hadithi. So Khattabi mentioned ulama of hadith, all the hadith to be da'afu, that is da'if. This narrator Aflatu, as they say it is majhul. Also that it is stated another of the ulama that Ibn Munzir in his book Al-Awsat where he mentioned والحديث عائشة قد ذكرته في غير هذا موضع وهو غير ثابت. So he mentioned that the hadith of Aisha هو غير ثابت, it is not authentic. Then again they mentioned regarding concerning that narrator who is discussed, and also of those who all the hadith to be a third or all the hadith to be da'if, Abdul Haq Al-Ishbili. So Abdul Haq Al-Ishbili صاحب الأحكام الوسطى that have several books in Hadith al-Ahkam that also he passed the judgment that the hadith it is that if you mention لا يثبت من قبل إسنادي, that it is not من قبل إسناده, that is not authentic based upon its isnad. Then also you find that of other ulama, Ibn Rushd even in his book Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, that also part of the journey of the hadith, it is ضعيف. So, and also of contemporary that we find that others that they mention Ibn Rajab. So Ibn Rajab also the hadith to be ضعيف. Also Al-Bayhaqi, as they state concerning that Ibn Rushd mentioned that Bayhaqi ضعفه. And also Ibn Rajab Al-Hanbali in his book Fath Al-Bari قال من حديث عائشة أو سلمة وفي إسنادهما ضعف. That hadith narrated by Aisha and also Salama, which is our the hadith being discussed, they mention في إسنادهما, in both of those two isnad of those narration, ضعف, there's weakness. So and also they mentioned that Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri, so Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri in his book Al-Muhalla also take the hadith to be ضعيف and very stern. And also of contemporary Sheikh Albani, so Sheikh in his book in the narration in the Ibn Majah, that they all to be ضعيف. So in the Ibn Majah, all the hadith to be ضعيف. So that's concerning some of the aqwal of the ulama pertaining to this particular hadith, where of the ulama, those of the hadith it is maqbul, sahih, or hasan, the least, and those who all the hadith to be ضعيف. So of those who criticize the hadith, or all the hadith to be ضعيف, that I mentioned, you know, that there's three reason for this. That I mentioned that al-ilal fil hadith thalatha. So they mentioned that of those one, I mentioned that one of the reason for criticizing hadith, that one of the narrating the hadith that is criticized. So one of the narrator first concerning Aflatu ibn Khalifa. So Aflatu ibn Khalifa, that they mention is majhul. So of those who mention a person who's unknown. So you have that discussion regarding that particular narrator, where some of the ulama take him to be someone who's majhul. Even though they mentioned that that particular narrator, Aflatu, that of those who all concerning that is hadith, it is suduq. That of those all concerning that is hadith, is suduq. So we have Aflatu, that is hadith, is on the discussion. We find that Ibn Hajar and also Al-Dhahabi, that takes that is someone who's suduq. So Ibn Hajar and Al-Dhahabi, that all that is hadith, it is suduq. And Ahmad bin Hanbal rahimahullah قال ليس به بس. Ahmad bin Hanbal قال ليس به بس. So Abu Hatim قال sheikh, that is a sheikh. Wa Ibn Hibban, he mentioned in his book Al-Thiqat. So that narrator, that is somewhat of those that have been criticized regarding this particular hadith. Abu Dawud al-Sijistani, when he mentioned this person, that he mentioned as Aflatu ibn Khalifa, that he mentioned قال Abu Dawud, that is in the isnad. Then he mentioned that قال Abu Dawud huwa fulayt, fulayt. So he mentioned that person Aflatu also referred to as Fulayt al-Amiri. So is referred to maybe as different names, but Aflatu or Fulayt is the same narrator as stated by Abu Dawud, or according to Abu Dawud. The second, so final discussion regarding that narrator. Some say is majhul, some say is suduq. That the second of the criticism of hadith that I mentioned in the isnad, also another narrator who's in the isnad, that is Jasra. So you have a Jasra bint Dijaja or Dajaja. So you have different ways that the ulama mention of some who say Dijaja and some will mention Dajaja. So it is Jusra or Jasra bint Dajaja or Dijaja. That also there's a discussion regarding that particular narrator, a discussion regarding that particular narrator. That Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned that fiha ajaib, fiha ajaib. So based upon this, that you have things that is somewhat amazing, or somewhat that is that one is taken aback. So and also you find that Daraqutni في سوالات للبرقاني قال يعبر بحديثها إلا أن يؤدد عنها من يترك. That the people who narrate upon her is people that are mutrak, people that are or left. So you have a discussion regarding her, even though she's mentioned by Ibn Hibban in his book Al-Thiqat, and also Al-Ijli in Tariq Al-Thiqat, that they mention regarding that, Haytha called Kufiyya, Tabi'iyya, Thiqa. So I see her as being took as so those who order she's Thiqa, and those who mentioned that she's of Ajaib. Then also that Ibn Hajar, and also in his book Taqrib Al-Tahdhib, that he mentioned that she's Maqbula, she's acceptable. So that level of hadith would be like a level of Hasan. And also it mentioned by Al-Dhahabi, Wathaqat, that those who somewhat ought to be Thiqa. So you find overall a discussion regarding that particular narrator or narrator, that Jasra bint Dajaja or Dijaja. And then the third illal of the hadith they mentioned regarding that of the ulama said the hadith fi ittirab. The hadith fi ittirab, so hadith al-muttarib, we find that they said that you have a country that an error occur. Some narration mentioned Salama, some hadith mentioned that the hadith of Aisha. So I find out to know that the hadith that he made an error, that is the hadith go back to Aisha, or the hadith goes back to Salama. So you have that discussion between the ulama regarding that. Did an error occur? So the hadith is muttarib, where at times the hadith is said to be from Aisha, and at times the hadith is said to be from Salama. So there's like an error. Did an error occur or a mistake that occur regarding this matter? So they said ittirab regarding this hadith. So I said the hadith is narrated by Abu Dawud from the hadith of Aisha, and the hadith is in the Ibn Majah from the hadith of Salama, and also in the Tabarani. Let's say overall regarding concerning this particular of the Mashaykh are those who have studied hadith that take the position the hadith is more close to that khilaf there. Those who say the hadith is da'if, and those who say the hadith it is maqbool. So you have that discussion between the ulama on this particular hadith. Check so you find that Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan that he mentioned here, فقد صححه قد اختلف العلماء في تصحيح هذا الحديث والاحتجاج به. That ulama they disagree regarding the authenticity of the hadith, and also that using it as an evidence. So they mentioned that hadith had been authenticated by Ibn Khuzaimah, as mentioned by Al-Hafiz, also of those who hold hadith to be Hassan, amongst them Ibn Qattan was Zayla'i, and also those who authenticate hadith as Shawkani, also and others, that Sheikh bin Baz of contemporary also mentioned hadith la bas bi isnadi, that Sheikh Abdul Aziz bin Baz rahimahullah ta'ala all the hadith that la bas bi isnadi, that the hadith can somewhat acceptable. So the hadith is said to be within enough those who are acceptable. Then they mention also of those who all the hadith to be daif, da'fahu akharun. We find that others of the ulama of hadith have taken the greatest hadith as daif. Minhum al-Bayhaqi قال ليس بقوي, also Abdul Haq al-Ishbili لا يثبت, and also they mention بالغ Ibn Hazm فقال إنه باطل, that Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri, that he was somewhat much more excessive and stern in his ruling, where he mentioned a hadith that it is batil, so much more excessive regarding his ruling by saying the hadith it is batil. So the hadith can somewhat revolves around that certain of those narrators that we have mentioned, those narrators that we have mentioned, of those who criticize some of the narrators, and those who mention hadith fi ittirab. So you have that discussion between regarding the ulama of that regarding that particular hadith, but then overall they discuss concerning after that matter, they discuss the next matter, which is the hukum of that hadith. So the next matter is the ruling that can be taken from this particular hadith. So this hadith of those hadith that is used regarding the ulama regarding on the discussion regarding, and you find that even that regarding the hukum of the hadith, that Sheikh Bassam, so Sheikh Bassam in his Tawdiyah Ahkam, in his explanation of Bulugh al-Maram, that he mentioned that he mentioned hadith is hadith Hasan. He mentioned Darajatul Hadith, hadith Hasan. So he can somewhat come to that conclusion regarding the hadith. As for the wording of the hadith, that they mentioned that one, the Prophet mentioned, La uhil al-masjid. So they mentioned that in the sense that La uhil indicating that something which is haram, which is hil, something will be said to be halal. The opposite of this is haram. It is not allowed. It is not allowed. So murad, with the Prophet mentioned what is intent, La urakhis, I'm not giving any concession or permissibility for the one in the state of janaba, sexual impurity, or a person or a woman who's in a state of haid, for them to remain in the masjid. For them to remain in the masjid. So they should not go into the masjid and remain in the masjid if they are in that state. And that's the mawdu of this hadith. So that's the mawdu. The main topic of this hadith is to discuss, is it allowed for one in a state of janaba, or one in a state of haid, or that would be a nufasa, and also the woman who's also after child bleeding, are they allowed to enter the masjid? So that will be the discussion. So that's the mawdu of this hadith. So that's the mawdu of this particular hadith. They mentioned regarding the general, so they mentioned, the Prophet mentioned, La uhil, that the Prophet ﷺ, as mentioned by Ibn Uthaymeen, the Prophet ﷺ is the one that, this hadith, it is indicating that the Prophet ﷺ is the one passing that judgment. So the Prophet ﷺ is the one who's making that legislation, passing that judgment, that it is not permitted for one in a state of janaba, sexual impurity, or the woman who's in her menstrual cycle, that she's not allowed to enter the masjid. So this ruling is going back directly to the Prophet ﷺ. But even though we know the concern of the one who, the Prophet ﷺ, that his judgment is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yuha ilay, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet ﷺ regarding these judgments. So even though it is being referred back to the Prophet ﷺ, but the asl of it, it goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarding the judgment of Islam. The Prophet ﷺ, yuballik, is one who that pass on the judgment, communicate the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to mankind. But he show also the Prophet ﷺ that also he makes these judgment, or attribute those judgment to himself. Attribute that judgment to himself. So as for the ahkam that can be taken from this hadith, that the hukum of the hadith, as we that the ulama discuss, that was the hukum for a one in a state of janaba, or a one in a state of haid, a woman, are they allowed to enter the masjid? So people in such state of janaba, where they're in a state of taharat al-kubra, or they're not those that need to perform ghusl, are they allowed to enter the masjid? So those who are in need of performing ghusl, or not in a state of tahara and required to perform ghusl, are they allowed to enter the masjid? So mention that junub, which is the case concerning junub, and anyone who's in that state of the person have had either sexual intimacy, or the person have release of mani, such a person, so the person of relief concerning that of mani, sperm discharge, such a person, or sexual intimacy have occurred, is such a person allowed to enter the masjid, and they are required to perform al-ghusl. Or a female that's in a state of haid, that she's in a monthly cycle, or she after, or mention of those concerning of the woman who's in a state of nifas, are they allowed after child bleeding, are they allowed to enter the masjid? So people in that category, are they allowed to enter the masjid? So from this hadith, that of the ulama who have mentioned from this hadith, they show that it is not allowed for one, al-labs, or makas, for them to go inside the masjid. It's not allowed, and it applies to be inside of the masjid. And with ahid also, nufasa will be included, and that's the view that is taken by jumhur of the ulama. So jumhur of the ulama take the position of a person in a state of najas al-kubra, that they are not allowed to enter the masjid, and required, and in that state they're required to perform ghusl. So jumhur of the ulama say, no, they are not allowed. It's impermissible for them to enter the masjid, prohibited for them to enter the masjid. Of those who take the position that they mentioned, that's the qawl, that's the view taken by jumhur of the ulama, and they use hadith amongst them, the Hanafiya, Malikiya, the Shafi'iyya, وكذلك الحنابلة في الحاهض, and that the Hanabila, that they agree regarding al-Hahid. And so Jumhur of the ulama take the position regarding that the state, a person in a state of Janaba or a woman in a state of her haid, that they are not, these group of people are not allowed to enter the masjid. So you find the Hanafiya take that position, the Malikiyya, the Shafi'iyya, وكذلك الحنابلة في الحاهد, and the Hanabila that is said regarding the state of the woman in a state of Hahid, Janaba, a next discussion with them. And so they use this hadith as a proof for their position, and also they use ayah. They use concern in Surah An-Nisa, where that's part of the main mention, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الصَّلَاةِ وَأَنْتُمْ سُقَارَى حَتَّى تَعْلَمُوا مَا تَقُولُونَ وَلَا جُنُبًا إِلَّا عَابِرِ السَّبِيلِ. So I mentioned, as the Shaykh mentioned, that you are not allowed to go, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الصَّلَاةِ, you are not allowed to go close to the salat, except for the one, وَأَنْتُمْ, and also for those in a state of drunkenness, until they are aware of what they are saying, and also a junub, and also the one in a state of janab. So I mentioned, وَلَا junub, that mentioned that, لَا تَقْرَبُوا الصَّلَاةِ, that also of those that are not allowed to go close to the salat, are those people in a certain state of those people. It mentioned here, the one who said to be in a state of drunkenness, and second, that the person in a state of junub, that they are not allowed, illa abir sabil, except for certain, the person wish to go through. So from this, we're Surah An-Nisa, verse 43. So by this they mentioned that the ulama, now a difference between the ulama regarding what's intended by wala la takrabu as-salat. So what's meant by salat? Of the ulama who take the position that what is meant by salat is masajid. That salat, what is meant by salat is masajid. You are not allowed to enter the masajid. You are not allowed to enter the masajid in a state of, with your state of drunkenness or your state of janaba. You are not allowed to enter the masajid mentioned, illa abri sabil, except for the one who wants to go through, except for the one that wish to go by. So that's concerning the first opinion regarding what is intended by as-salat, what is meant by as-salat. So other opinion of the ulama, that they mention that what is intended by salat, that is meant by salah. You are not allowed to la taqrabu as-salat. You are not allowed to go close to salat. Wa antum sukhara, and your state of sukhara, so the person who in a state of drunkenness is not allowed to pray. Not go close to salat, not allowed to pray. And also the person in a state of janaba, except also the person in a state of janaba is not allowed to pray. So you have those aqwal between the ulama as to what is intended by as-salat, what is intended by salat. So they mention a person regarding as-salat and the makan of salat, that one should not enter. That's the view taken by Ibn Mas'ud, Ibn Abbas, and of the ulama who are in line with that view, of those who are in line with that view. So of the ulama, so that's concerning that matter regarding that discussion. So a khilaf between the ulama, but I mentioned that this matter regarding concern a person musafir. So of those who mentioned that the hadith is regarding that person, yes, regarding also regarding the musafir, that they are the musafir, regarding that in this case regarding that wala junub, that they, if they need to pray, then they perform, and they are not allowed, they are unable to perform because they're musafir and they are not able to perform al-ghusl, then they should that if they're unable to take a ghusl, then they should perform tayammum. So that's concerning that discussion between the ulama on this ayah regarding as to what is intended. So they mention wala junuban illa abid sabil. So they said that now they mentioned that this ayah mentioned that wala junuban, that not for the person state of janaba, illa, to enter to pray, إلا عابر السبيل, except for the person I mentioned that is meant by عابر السبيل, the person musafir. That I mentioned حتى تغتسلوا, you can go by that you can do so until you perform ghusl. So if you're not able to perform ghusl, then tayammum. That if tayammum is done, then the person that they can make their salah. So they mentioned that is regarding al-musafir, that's regarding al-musafir. So you have that aqwal between the ulama as to what is intended and how the ayah is to be understood regarding as-salat and matter regarding the person's state of janaba. So that's the first call of the ulama on this matter, the first view of the ulama on this regarding this matter. Then of the ulama who all concerning that they give some allowance. Of the ulama that they give some allowance regarding that one. If the person perform al-wudu, so if you perform al-wudu, then you can enter the masjid. The person's state of janaba, but if they were to perform al-wudu, then they can enter the masjid. Then they can enter the masjid after performing al-wudu. So that's a view taken by some of the ulama on this matter, where the person that if he was to perform al-wudu, then he can enter the masjid. But this is after performing al-wudu. And there's a third opinion of the ulama that take the position the person yajuz, that the person, both of them, the junub and the person and the woman in the state of haid, that they can enter the masjid mutlaqa. And that's the view taken by Dawud al-Zahiri and also al-Muzani min al-Shafi'iyya. So Dawud al-Zahiri and al-Muzani take the position that they can enter the masjid. And I mentioned that the reason that one, the hadith that discussed the matter, the hadith of Aisha and the hadith of Salama, fi kalam, that the hadith for them, it is weak. So the hadith is weak, so it cannot be used as an evidence. And also they mentioned the ayah is not explicit. So they mentioned that whatever had been mentioned explicit, that one is not allowed to enter the masjid in state of junub or haid, that those hadith are da'if. And as for the ayah, it's somewhat, it could be that there's a khilaf regarding its meaning and what is in the meaning. So they said, because there's nothing explicit and clear and straightforward, they said to know that the asl is that it's allowed until there's something to say otherwise. So it's allowed, baqa ma kan, so it remain as it is until there's something to say otherwise. So that's concerning, so of sort of the aqwal of the ulama, so those who say they cannot at all, those who mention that they're only allowed if they perform, and some mention they perform wudu, some mention regarding that the wudu is in a state, so the person's state of janaba, or for the case of the person in the state of haid, and there's a khilaf in the ulama on that matter, but generally of those who say they could if they perform al-wudu. And of those who mentioned that it's allowed mutlaqa, and that's the Dawud al-Zahiri and others who have taken that particular position. So those are aqwal of the ulama on that matter regarding the permissibility or not. As we mentioned, jumhur of the ulama min bab al-ahwat, but one might say a call of jumhur is the safer aqwal regarding this matter. But of those who even mentioned that it can be done, the ulama mentioned in that discussion that she has to, who they enter the masjid, that they have to be wearing something so as not nothing fall onto the floor, especially the woman who's in a state of haid. So she need to enter according to the view that says she can, that she must be she must be wearing something that prevents that discharge from getting onto the masjid or getting into the masjid, as that's considered to be blood which is najas. It's considered to be blood which is najas. And of those who mentioned that they give some concession regarding al-junub. So of those who mentioned that the person's state of janaba, faqat, not for the haid, not for the woman on menstruation, she can enter if they perform wudu. So the person with the state of junub can enter. If he performs wudu, he can enter. And as for the woman in a state of janaba, then no, that she's not. And that's a certain qawl of Ahmed, and that's a view taken by Ibn Taymiyyah, that make a distinction to Ibn Taymiyyah, that the person's state of junub أنه يجوز الجنوب فقط أن يمكث في المسجد إن كان متوضئا. So that's the call that is taken of رواه أحمد. وبه قال إمام أحمد اختاره ابن تيمية. أنا mention عطاء بن يسار قال رأيت رجال من أصحاب النبي عليه السلام يجلسون في المسجد وهم مجنبون, that is a state of janaba, إذا توضعوا وضوء الصلاة, that if they perform the wudu of that of salat. And that particular narration they mention that عطاء بن يسار, that's narrated in the Sa'id bin Mansur in his collection, in his book of Hadith. So those are the aqwal of the ulama on this matter regarding this khilaf between the ulama. Then, so that's concerned a person they mentioned that there's nothing that stopped the Hadith from entering the masjid except this particular hadith. As for the ayah is regarding al-junub. And as for this hadith includes al-hahid, the one in a menstruation. So based upon those aqwal of the ulama who mentioned that with these things, that the hadith is da'if and the ayah is regarding a junub, and also they see it as that what is intended. So they see it as they are allowed. Both are allowed to enter the masjid. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Then they discuss concerning the next matter regarding concerns that it is stated here regarding concerning Ibn Raslan of those of explanation of the book of Sunan Abu Dawud. So Ibn Raslan, that a Shafi'i, that as a book that explain Sunan Abu Dawud, it mainly discuss concerning Masal al-Fiqh, and that book comes in many volumes that come over 20 volumes in some print and some print more than this. That Ibn Raslan, who explains Sunan Abu Dawud, he mentioned استدل به على تحريم اللبث في المسجد والعبور فيه, that this is used as a proof regarding for a person, those in a state of janaba or in a state of janaba are required to perform ghusl, whether by state of janaba or in a state of or because of haid, menstrual cycle, that they should not go through the masjid, nor are they allowed to sit in the masjid or to stay in the masjid. سواء كان للحاجة, whether for a reason, for a reason, أو لغيرها, or for no reason, legitimate reason, قاهم أو جالس, whether they standing or sitting, أو متردد, or moving in between, على أي حال, متوضٍ كان أو غيره, whether they're a state of wudu or not in a state of wudu. لإطلاق هذا hadith, said because of the general ruling of this hadith. Because the hadith is general, it doesn't make any distinction regarding wudu, standing, sitting, going through or not. You are not allowed at all. So it said based upon this, you are not allowed to go on that into the masjid at all. Then I mentioned that then he stated concerning and Sufyan حكاه ابن منذر عن سفيان الثوري وأبي أنيفة وأصحابه وإسحاق ابن راهوية ولا يجوز العبور إلا أن لا يجد بدا منه فليتوضأ ثم يمر. So Abdullah mentioned that if the person should not allow, is not allowed to go through the masjid, pass through the masjid, unless they have no other way. And if they have no other way, labud, then I mentioned that if they have to do so, that they have to perform wudu. And the sentence, فَيَتَوَضَّى ثُمَّ يَمُرْ, then they perform wudu, then they walk through the masjid. فَإِنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ مَا فَتَيَمُّمْ, and if they haven't found water, فَإِنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ الْمَاء فَتَيَمُّمْ, then they perform tayammum. If they does not find water, tayammum, they perform tayammum. If they want to go by or go through, so if water is found, perform wudu, even and then they can go through. If they did not find water, perform tayammum, and they can go through. They mention ومذهب أحمد, and the view of Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, يباح العبور في المسجد للحاجة من أخذ شيء من أخذ شيء أو تركه أو كان الطريق فيه وأما غير ذلك فلا يجوز بحال. So I mentioned Ahmed rahimahullah ta'ala kind of somewhat mentioned that it's permissible for a person to go through the masjid lil haja if there's a need. So if there's a need, one can go through the masjid if there's a need for you to take something or to leave it. To take something, to fetch something or to leave something. أو كون طريق فيه, or that there's a path to get from one side to the next, that to get to there one can do so. وأما غير ذلك, as for other than this, فلا يجوز بحال, is not allowed. So if there's no need, one is not allowed. One is not allowed if there is no need. So that's concerning of those aqwal between the ulama on this matter, and of the evidence that is used regarding concerning of those that mention regarding concerning with this particular hadith. So of this matter, that's concerned of those matters that are discussed regarding this particular hadith. So that's the first hadith that is discussed regarding the permissibility of passing through the masjid or sitting in the masjid for a person who is in a state of janaba. And as we have stated, aqwal of the ulama on this topic. The next hadith that he mentioned here is the hadith, again, an Aisha, rata anha, with the Prophet ﷺ, rata anha. And also this hadith, it showed the virtue of the masjid. The hadith overall showed concerning that the hadith highlight the virtue of the masjid, that the masjid is a place to be respected, and also that things that's said to be things of filth, that one should avoid of the masjid. And also if the person not in a proper state, then also they should not enter the masjid. The person is not in an appropriate state regarding the level of cleanliness and tidiness and cleanliness, then they should not enter the masjid. They should not enter the masjid. As for the person, that the person may not be in a state of tahara, but he can remain in the masjid if he's not in a state of tahara. So the person in a state of that requires al-wudu and in the masjid, then he is okay in that with this. Then I mentioned the second hadith to be discussed. عنها من عائشة رضي عنها قالت كنت اغتسل أنا ورسول الله رسول الله عليه السلام من إناء واحد, that I used to that me and the Prophet عليه السلام, that we would wash from the same bucket, إناء تختلف أيدينا, and our hands, that they were kind of somewhat mixed together, فيه من جنابة, and we were both in a state of janaba. So that's the hadith that he mentioned here, and the hadith he mentioned متفق عليه. Then also he mentioned وزاد ابن حبان وتلقي أيدينا, that our hands also used to touch each other while we are in this while performing ghusl or bathing together. So I mentioned regarding concerning first a takhrij of the hadith. The hadith, as you mentioned, متفق عليه, the hadith in the Bukhari and Muslim. Also the hadith in Ahmed, Nasahi, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, الدارمي, تحاوي في شر معاني الآثار, بيهقي. Also the hadith in the Abu Awana, الشافعي, حميدي, طيالسي, Ibn Jarud, and الدارقطني وابن حبان. So the hadith in many sources. So again, Bukhari, Muslim, Ahmed in his Musnad, Nasa'i, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah. So the hadith not in the At-Tirmidhi, so it's in the Nasa'i, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, Darami, Tahawi, Bayhaqi, Abu Awana, Ash-Shafi, Humaydi, so Shafi in his Musnad, attributed to him, Ibn Jarud, Daraqutni, and Ibn Hibban. So these are the source of that hadith. Or so as for this particular hadith that they mentioned regarding concerning this particular hadith, that that of the benefit it can be taken from the hadith, that as mentioned here by the Mashaykh who have explained this book, amongst them Bassam and others, that the fiqh of the hadith, first of the fiqh of the hadith, that so from this it mentioned regarding concerning there's a discussion regarding concern that so a discussion regarding that mentioned that taltaqi regarding concern that taltaqi yani aydihima that is mentioned regarding that of the ulama who mentioned regarding that is this mudraj from some of the narrators, is this additional wording that I mentioned, that is this mudraj from some of the narrator or is a part of the hadith. So you have that discussion between the ulama regarding هذا يشعر أن هذا الزيادة من تفسير بعض الرواة. So it seems as if it may be taken that this is a ziyada from some of the narrators was said to be either mudraj وليس من hadith, and it's not from the hadith. لعلها مدرج من بعض الرواة السند. So some may take that this additional wording and that is in the Ibn Hibban, that is the mudraj, possible mudraj from some of the narrators, kind of sound to give some more clarity. But you have that discussion between, as mentioned by Ibn Hajar in his book Fath al-Bari. The next of the thing that they are discussed regarding this particular hadith, regarding the masail, fiqh al-hadith. So the hadith regarding iktisal al-rajul ma imratihi. Regarding the hadith is discussed, a man, husband, taking a bath with his wife. Taking a bath with his wife, or ghusl with his wife. That amatul ulama, that mention, la yakra, an yaktasil al-rajul ma zawjatihi. That it is, they see nothing wrong and disliked by a man taking a bath, even performing ghusl with his wife, both together, that from the same vessel. So both taking from that to perform ghusl, that both see it as something which is allowed. So they see it as something which is allowed. And be done the same time. I mentioned this, I mentioned, إني كنت لا أغتسل أنا ورسول الله عليه السلام من إناء واحد تختلف أيدينا فيه. And that our hands were like, moving about, our hands were both our hands were taking water from the same vessel. So they show that that from this hadith it shows regarding that they were taking water from the vessels, both were performing al-ghusl. So it showed the permissibility of this. And they discussed that from the hadith it shows regarding that the hadith is to show regarding the Prophet ﷺ relationship with his wives, that the Prophet ﷺ would even perform take a bath, a ghusl with his wife. And I mentioned from this that both will be exposing of themselves. So show that the permissibility for a wife and a husband to take a bath together and even performing al-ghusl in a religious way together. So the hadith al-ghusl could be by way of both just taking a bath together in general, or it could be taking a bath by way of a ghusl together. So they mentioned that both taking from water from the same vessel. So another case where that one perform ghusl in the bath and then the other follow them after, then that's not the case, but both were doing it together at the same time. So that showed the Prophet ﷺ somewhat his relation with his wife regarding al-ulfa wal-mahabba, for him to at times will perform ghusl with his wife. Should the permissibility of this. Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah ta'ala discussed regarding from the hadith also what can be taken from the hadith, the permissibility for a person to expose, husband and wife to expose themselves. So to expose their nakedness to each other, as in this particular hadith of Aisha, where if both were taking a bath together from the same vessel, that they must have been doing so and was ghusl, taking a bath, that they would be unclothed, naked, exposing themselves to each other. So it's something which is allowed and permissible, contrary to a view that is maybe taken by others. So also it shows that that both putting their hand in the vessel, that it doesn't make the water impure. Also from this it shows that both taking from that vessel, the water from the bucket, it doesn't make that water impure. So from this, that these are the hadith that I mentioned here regarding concerning. And the hadith, so that's concerning that, or this is what is mentioned regarding this particular hadith, regarding of those ahkam that relates to al-ghusl. So the hadith that we discussed regarding that a person in state of janaba, or a woman in her, during her cycle, is she allowed to enter the masjid or not? We have discussed that matter from what is taken from this hadith. And the second hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha is discussing the matter regarding in taking a ghusl, that the permissibility for husband and wife to take ghusl together, and also with this they will be seeing each other nakedness, and this is something which is allowed and not something which is, and a hadith on that matter is somewhat da'if. So hadith regarding not exposing oneself to one's wife, that you might find that most of the hadith on that topic is somewhat da'if. So that inshallah ta'ala will be of those masahil that relates to this particular matter. So before we end, that Shaykh Bassam in his explanation he mentioned ما يأخذ من حديث, so what can be taken from the hadith he mentioned وجوب اغتسال من جنابة على رجل والمرأة, that a male and a female that in a state of janaba you must perform ghusl. So the general rule, if a person in a state of janaba, then ghusl is required. The second regarding that أن اغتسال المرأة والرجل, that المرأة الزوج, a husband and wife, من إناء واحد, that is something which is allowed. It is something which is allowed. And also لا تؤثر في طهارة الماء بالإجماع, that both taken from the water, it doesn't per se turn the water into something which is impure. So both putting their hands in the water doesn't make the water impure. And also should have permitted the person in a state of janaba to place their hands and take water from the bucket. The bucket of water, one can put one hand in to take water from this, as the hadith it proves. And also it shows regarding that husband and wife seeing each other, even in a state of nakedness. Husband and wife seeing each other, even in a state of nakedness. And also it shows that the Prophet Islam concerns husn al-ishra, the Prophet Islam regarding himself and his family, that he tries to live good with his wife and his family, and also doing things together, and all of those things that at times that they may take a bath together, at times to take a bath together. And also it showed the Prophet Islam that type of that also that that it showed the virtue of his wife Aisha radiallahu anha, that they were that close that at times they would take a bath together and do things together. And also she'll narrate these matters that she and the Prophet Islam participated in together. So she and her husband, the Prophet Islam, doing together, that she'll share these things with, and these things are transmitted to us. And also with both of them kind of somewhat performing water in a they mention that indicate that both sharing a bucket of water. So both kind of somewhat trying to mince it in that trying to use what is required of the water, and that maybe not much water because both two individuals sharing a bucket of water. So trying to use them to minimize the waste of water and to maximize the use of that water, so both could take a bath from one vessel. So and also it shows that husband and wife taking water from the same vessel, that is permissible. So from the same vessel being shared by others, that is also, it is permissible. So that are some of the ahkam and the fawahid that can be taken from this hadith. So this inshallah ta'ala will end this discussion and continue the other ahadith that relates to al-ghusl in the coming session. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه السبيل والآخر دعونا الحمد لله العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. What time is it now?